Good morning, and welcome to the second of three videos on the digestive system and nutrition. So, in this video, we're going to go through the remainder of the digestive system. Remember, in the first video, we went from the mouth, ingestion, uh, down through the pharynx and the esophagus. And the esophagus ends in the stomach. So, that's where we'll pick up today. So, the stomach itself is an organ which, when empty, is about the size of your fist. So think about that. But it can swell a little bit, stretch a little bit to take in a goodly amount of food. So if you eat a big meal, your stomach will stretch. The function of the stomach is to store food, to start the digestion of proteins, and then essentially govern when the food is digested enough to enter the small intestine. The organ itself, it has a slightly J shape to it, and it's got a very thick muscular wall. Um, there are actually three different layers of muscles, and they're arranged in different ways, different orientations. And so, when they're all kind of moving and stretching, this does a couple of things. First of all, it moves the food around and kind of stirs it up, but it also helps to continue the mechanical digestion that was begun by the teeth. Now, there are deep little pits called gastric pits, and you can see one, or actually several, in this picture here. But this is a gastric pit up here, and there are glands beneath that secrete what we call gastric juice. Now, the juice itself contains a couple of things. First, it contains an enzyme called pepsin, Pepsin. And pepsin begins the digestion of proteins. All right. Remember, carbohydrates we started digesting in the mouth. All right. But proteins have been left alone until they get to the stomach. Um, it also contains hydrochloric acid, which helps to actually activate the pepsin and kill any bacteria that was in or on your food when you consumed it. And the last thing that the gastric juice contains is mucus. Now, the mucus is important because what it does is it lines the inner layers of the stomach so that very strong stomach acid doesn't actually begin to destroy the foods. Now, people who have gastric reflux and ulcers and that sort of thing, what's happened there is that the mucus has failed to protect the wall of the stomach, and that leads to some discomfort. All right. Now, one more thing that I do want to point out here is that we're still just digesting the food. We have not gotten to the absorption stage yet. No absorption takes place in the stomach. All right. So we've begun the digestion of carbohydrates and now the proteins. Okay. So back to our Big Mac example. All right. What kinds of things that you find in a Big Mac actually contain proteins, which will be digested by pepsin? Well, obviously, the beef, if it really is beef, is found in a Big Mac, and that contains a great deal of protein. But the cheese, which I'm not really sure if McDonald's uses real cheese or not, I tend to doubt it. But let's pretend for a moment that it is. Cheese is a dairy product, it's an animal product, and it does contain a great deal of protein. Real cheese does anyway, along with other things as well. All right. But in eating a Big Mac, in terms of digestion, in the stomach, the enzyme pepsin begins to digest those proteins. Now, from the stomach, the food, which is now called chyme, is passed into the small intestine. But before we get into what happens in the small intestine, I do want to point out that there are three accessory organs that are important in this whole process as well. And they are the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. Now, This funky little diagram here shows the relative location of each of these. This is essentially a picture with the stomach removed, okay? The liver is not truly a digestive organ, but we'll come back to it later on when we talk about the distribution of nutrients. But it does secrete a substance called bile, which helps to break down fats. So it produces and secretes the bile. The bile then goes down and is stored in the gallbladder. And once you have eaten a meal and a fatty food has entered the top portion of the small intestine, which you see here, all right, this is called the duodenum, all right, this part of the small intestine, the bile will then be released from the gallbladder and enter the duodenum. The pancreas secretes enzymes and other chemicals that also assist with the digestive process. So let's talk about what each of these organs does individually. The pancreas itself is a fish-shaped, spongy organ behind the stomach. It's not made of muscle. It's mostly glands. And its function in terms of digestion is twofold. All right. First, it secretes enzymes, lots of enzymes in this case. It secretes an enzyme called trypsin, which continues the digestion of proteins. All right. So we're still moving on with the digestion of proteins. It also secretes pancreatic amylase. Remember amylase? We had salivary amylase in the mouth to digest carbohydrates. So we're continuing the digestion of those nutrients. But also now, for the first time, excuse me, we have secreted an enzyme which digests fats, and this is called lipase. All right. So 3 enzymes for the 3 major nutrients. Another important thing that is secreted by the pancreas is what we call bicarbonate. And this is an extremely basic substance which helps to neutralize the acid that comes out of the stomach. Remember, the stomach is protected by all those layers of mucus, all right? And but the small intestine is not. And so if you simply dump that very acidic chyme into the small intestine without neutralizing the acid, the small intestine would begin to be digested. That would be a bad thing. All right. And so the pancreas secretes bicarbonate, which neutralizes the stomach acids. So those 2 functions, all right, numbers 1 and 2 on this list, are digestive in nature. Now, the pancreas also secretes a hormone called insulin. And insulin is not a digestive material. The pancreas actually secretes insulin into the blood, and it helps to maintain homeostasis with your blood sugar levels. All right, you don't want them too high, you don't want them too low. All right, but even though insulin is not a digestive substance, I did want to mention it here. So the first 2 are for digestion. Now, the liver is a very large metabolic organ that sits right under your diaphragm, so just below your rib cage. And it contains about 100,000 lobules. Its job is to filter blood that's coming out of the small intestine, a little bit lower down than we currently sit. And its job is to remove poisons, toxins, alcohol, certain drugs, and that sort of thing from the blood. It also takes iron and the vitamins A, D, E, K, and B12 from the blood and stores them for later use. It will store glucose, the simplest carbohydrate, as a complex carbohydrate called glycogen. And then when your blood sugar levels go down, it helps to break it down to maintain homeostasis in your blood sugar levels. It makes certain proteins for your blood plasma, and it helps to regulate your cholesterol levels. And finally, from the bloodstream, it helps to break down hemoglobin. So we mention it here because of the idea of it's part of the digestive tract, but it's not actually doing digestion. The most important thing for digestion that it does is the production of bile salts, which is this substance that's stored in the gallbladder for to help break down fats. So speaking of the gallbladder, the liver makes the bile, which is its only really digestive function, and then the bile is stored in the gallbladder, and it's secreted slowly into the small intestine to help emulsify fat. Now, this word emulsify is an interesting word. It does not truly mean a chemical digestion of fat into its component parts. What it does is it takes a big fat droplet and it turns them into lots of little fat droplets. All right. And the reason for this is that the little fat droplets are easier to digest. All right. But emulsification is not digestion. The easiest example of emulsification is if you've ever washed a sink full of greasy dishes. All right. You see these big fat globules floating on the water and that sort of thing. If you add soap to that sink, all of a sudden those big fat globules turn into a gazillion little fat globules, and that is emulsification. It's still fat. It hasn't been broken down chemically, but now it's in smaller pieces, smaller parts, and so the gallbladder releases the bile to help break down the fat into smaller pieces so that it can then be digested by the lipase that comes from the pancreas. Okay. Now that we've talked about the three accessory organs, let's talk about the small intestine. Now, the small intestine is literally anything but small. It is about 6 meters long. That's 18 feet. All right. Think about that. 18 feet of intestines. All right. It's a pretty long tube. The enzymes that come out of the pancreas digest carbohydrates and proteins and fats, and this all occurs in the duodenum, the first foot or so of the small intestine. Of course, bile is secreted by the gallbladder into the small intestine to emulsify fats, and all of that occurs in the duodenum. However, the next 16 or 17 feet of the small intestine is mostly for the absorption of nutrients. All right. Now, absorption, believe it or not, occurs by the process of diffusion. Praise Jesus, right? We're back to diffusion again. All right. So no energy is really required for this. But what do you need for effective diffusion? You need a big surface area. All right. And so the inside of the small intestine has all of these finger-like projections, and you can see them here. All right. It's almost like a shag carpet. But in each of these, or on each of these finger-like projections, which are called villi, there are gazillions of microvilli, and you can see them here in this microscopic picture, all right, which are teeny tiny little finger-like projections. And again, the villi increase the surface area, the microvilli increase the surface area even more, all right, and this gives us a great deal of surface area for diffusion to take place. Now, inside the villi are blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, all right? So when the nutrients diffuse into the villi, they are then picked up either by the bloodstream or by the lymphatic system. It turns out that both are necessary. Amino acids and sugars enter the capillaries, all right, the bloodstream, while fatty acids and glycerol enter what we call the lacteals. That's what we call the lymphatic vessels that enter here. All right, so capillaries and lacteals, and so the capillaries take the amino acids and sugars, and the lacteals take the fatty acids and glycerol. Now, it turns out they both bring these components to the liver, but using different routes. Okay, and so again, this is where all absorption takes place. the amino acids, the sugars, and the fatty acids and glycerol, all of them get absorbed in the lower portion of the small intestine. No absorption takes place in the mouth. No absorption takes place in the stomach. All right. No absorption even takes place in the first foot or so of the small intestine. Okay. So let's talk about the digestive process in the small intestine. All right, in the duodenum, that first portion, we have pancreatic amylase digesting carbohydrates. All right, the complex carbs are finally completely broken down, and the simple carbs may be broken down even further. There's trypsin to digest proteins, and then finally, the bile emulsifies fat, and then lipase digests those teeny tiny particles of fat. And so a great deal of digestion occurs here. All right. Now, from the small intestine, the what's left over, what hasn't been absorbed, comes into the large intestine. So here is the small intestine, and you can see this little opening which dumps food into the large intestine. Now, the large intestine includes the cecum, which is this. Come on now, please. This area in here, okay, and the colon, which has three parts, and then the rectum and the anus. All right, it is larger in diameter than the small intestine, which is why we call it the large intestine, but it's much shorter. All right, it literally goes up and across and down across your belly. Now, the cecum has a small projection on the end called the appendix. And the authors of your textbook say that it may play a role in fighting infections, but probably not. All right, it's mostly there as a vestigial organ, something that we don't really use anymore. However, in herbivorous animals like cows and rabbits and animals like that, it is much, 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 much longer. All right, like 100 times the size that it is in human beings, at least relatively speaking. And what happens is that vegetation goes in there and is broken down by bacteria. All right, we are not by biology anyway. Vegetarian organisms. All right, we are designed to eat meat. All right, and vegetables too. We are omnivores. And I'm not talking. If you choose not to eat meat, that's your business. But your digestive system is designed to be omnivorous. Now, not herbivorous. So, what does the large intestine do? Well, its main job is to absorb water, which helps us to prevent dehydration. So, by absorbing water, I mean putting it back into the body as opposed to pooping it out. It also absorbs vitamins, especially the B complex vitamins and vitamin K, which is produced by bacteria, naturally occurring bacteria that live in our intestines. And then eventually it forms and then rids the body of feces through the anus. Now, feces is not ever inside your body. It's still within the tunnel. All right. We essentially, your food passes from your mouth to your anus. And what we do is we pick off all the things that we want, the amino acids, the simple sugars, and that sort of thing. And whatever's left over is then pooped out. Now, it turns out that most of what's left over is the cellulose that's found in plants. So when you eat a Big Mac in the lettuce and the pickles and that sort of thing, it's the roughage that is left over, the indigestible material, the stuff that you couldn't make any use of, that is then eliminated as feces. Okay. Now, does that mean you shouldn't eat plants? By all means, no. All right. You need a good deal of roughage in your diet. It turns out that your poop itself is about 75% water and 25% fiber. All right. And indigestible material. And so you want to have roughage in your diet because it helps to control cholesterol and a variety of other things, but it keeps everything moving through the digestive system. So you do need to eat plant material. All right. So eat your vegetables, boys and girls. All right. So that brings us to a Mr. Anderson video about the digestive system. So have a look at this either directly from the PowerPoint or you can simply look it up if you wish. But take 10 minutes or so and watch this video that's posted here, and then come back and watch the third and final of the 3 videos on the digestive system. All right. So again, have a look at this video, and I hope you learned something.